There was a lot here from the vice president as he clearly took on Democrats. He lashed out. He took on members of the media. He's clearly frustrated at the coverage here, even with clearly also a lot of questions about this shooting, which is part of why this investigation is happening, led by the FBI.
It was extraordinary to have the vice president in the briefing room. That's rare in and of itself, and to be willing to take questions. And he had a very clear mission with a number of those points that you just referenced. First, the announcement about a new position at the Department of Justice, which will look at fraud much more broadly. But on the specific effects of what happened in Minnesota, the death of this woman, the attention around the ICE agent, the vice president was very clear that he is prepared to make assessments right now based on what he has seen in the video. I asked him if he had any additional sources of information, which could certainly happen given his prominent position, and he did not engage on that. In fact, he said it's pretty much on its face what people have, all of us have been able to see and make our own judgments about. Clearly, as vice president, he wants to show support for federal agents and to remind people about the risks to them. That's expected, and that is certainly appropriate in his role. What he was not able to do is to really engage on issues of, are his words or those of the president, where they've made some conclusions about the woman involved and the circumstances. Could those impede the investigation? Could those shape the public understanding before all the facts are known? As people are learning more about Renee Good, there's so much we don't know yet about her and what she was doing prior to the moments when the videos we've all seen were made available to us. So there are questions that need to be asked. There also would need to be questions about what was the thinking of the officer? Why was deadly force used? Is that a part of his training? We do know he's a veteran of federal law enforcement. We do know he has a history of being injured on the job, and could that affect his thinking? The vice president suggested that it might affect how he would view the vehicle. The vice president did not engage on matters of, could the woman have been trying to drive away? Could there have been some other explanation? He appeared very comfortable with the idea that she was motivated to try to impede federal law enforcement. And it is unclear to me that there is an established piece of evidence about that at this point. So what comes from this? Certainly the vice president was critical of officials in Minnesota, said they didn't really have a role to play in the investigation, and that this is a matter being handled by the Department of Homeland Security and other parts of the government. The vice president very much wanted to push the narrative that certainly the federal government has support for its officers, criticism of the way this has been characterized in the media. You and I both know there's enormous care inside our organization about taking steps to weigh and vet and deal with all the information before we share it publicly. So some of what he is critical of, I don't know what media specifically he is referring to. And that, of course, is a frequent narrative, the administration challenging the media. That's fine. That's part of the process. But there are many questions still to be asked. It was notable and perhaps valuable that the vice president was willing to engage and willing to talk about this and to lay out larger steps about this new position, which will be Senate confirmed, they say, at the Department of Justice, which would look at some of these issues. We've known for months that the administration has wanted to take on the broader political motivations of what they call the radical left and activism there. Who pays for that? How is it organized? All those questions. Those are big questions, ongoing questions. There are a lot more discrete, specific questions still to be learned about the events in Minnesota, the fallout of that, the human piece of it for the woman, her family, her community, as well as the officer involved, who will certainly face a lot of attention, and the other officers who will also have their actions scrutinized more because of what's happened.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.